But I thought what we might do is go out of order and have the benefit of the NGO perspective on the case for a nuclear ban treaty and turn to Beatrice Fihn, the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, who has joined us from Geneva. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You threw me a little bit off guard there, but luckily I actually did prepare a few hours before. So thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as many of you might have heard, the first draft text of a treaty banning nuclear weapons was presented last week. And this is obviously not a final version, but it's just, from my perspective, really exciting to for the first time see text on paper. It makes it very concrete and difficult for some to continue ignoring this. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the reasoning behind the ban treaty and sort of also address a couple of points on what we hope the treaty will do and maybe talk a little bit about some misconceptions of what it won't do. And by almost any definition, nuclear weapons would be classified as indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. But unfortunately, it's taken decades to discuss nuclear weapons through a humanitarian lens. And I kind of think that it shows how we as humans tend to forget and disguise and deny what's overwhelming and terrifying. For far too long, states that have nuclear weapons and states that imagine themselves to be protected by them, and states that might want to develop them and have them in the future, have created an aura around nuclear weapons. The destructive capacities of this weapon has served to inspire awe rather than disgust and condemnation. And the impact that nuclear weapons have on humans, the environment, development, and the economy, both in the short term and long term, and across borders and regions, have instead been seen as the ultimate guarantee of security. But we built security around a weapon that's too big, too clumsy, and too inhumane to use. It's the only weapon that has as its main purpose to prevent itself. Nuclear weapons, at enormous expense and in large numbers, are supposed to remain in their silos, quietly, never unleashed. And it really doesn't make any sense. Nuclear weapons are not magic. Perhaps it seemed like that in 1945, when the atom was first split and nuclear technology was new, exciting, and modern. Today, it's not. Nuclear weapons do not deter security threats of the 21st century. Non-state actors in terrorism, climate change, migration, cybersecurity, failed states, religious extremists, none of these threats can be fought with nuclear weapons. In addition, the overwhelming majority of countries in the world have decided to never acquire nuclear weapons, and that it does not benefit their security to have these weapons. And yes, some, through alliance and treaty arrangements, have been assured of the use of nuclear weapons in their defense, should the situation ever arise. But most countries have sought the opposite, demanding that they never be used against them under any circumstances. So proliferation and reliance on nuclear weapons for security, despite what experts and some politicians might say, is actually not the norm. And how we see weapons and their utility changes. And I think it can be naive to think that we will continue forever to see nuclear weapons in the same way as we did in 1945. For example, chemical weapons were the aspirational modern weapon of choice for many countries over a century ago. Their inhumane impacts, however, destroyed any credibility that any country that wished to portray itself as civilized. As part of the development of laws of war and what became known as international humanitarian law, the use of chemical and biological weapons was outlawed in 1925. The possession of these weapons were banned by treaties in 1992 and 1972. Chemical weapons were deemed to be against the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. And the inhumane effects of chemical weapons provide the most sickening reading: vomiting, immediate smothering, choking, blistering, convulsions, loss of bodily control, long-term nerve damage of survivors. Death through chemical weapons exposures could be seen as a mercy, and so too for nuclear weapons. We should not be proud of the idea that some countries' security is based on the threat of instant vaporization of large numbers of civilians, and an enormous number subjected to excruciatingly painful death caused by fires, blasts, and overwhelming prompt nuclear radiation. And following the immediate devastating impact of a nuclear weapon, first responders and medical personnel, if not killed and incapacitated themselves, would be unable to administer adequate care to survivors. The remaining survivors would be coping with radioactive fallout, contamination, and environmental devastation. Depending on other factors, there will be far-reaching regional and global impacts on food and water resources, not to mention the psychological scarring that will pervade and persist through generations. As a survivor of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima said once, "The living envied the dead." And we need to base our response and actions around nuclear weapons based on what they are and what they do, rather than what we're imagining them to be. Nuclear weapons are big, clumsy weapons that go bang, do terrible things to living creatures, and leave behind an almighty mess. In that regard, they are the same as landmines, cluster munitions, chemical and biological weapons. We have outlawed those inhumane, military, useless weapons because they were finally understood for what they were. And now, we're banning nuclear weapons. And just as a quick point, a ban on nuclear weapons is not a shortcut. It's not an attempt to force certain countries to unilaterally disarm. And it's not an all-encompassing solution to our global security problems. It's a legal fix. Weapons that do this, that have these kind of consequences, should not be considered legal under international law. And we've seen that the first draft of the treaty, it's obviously a lot of work left to be done. It contains a strong categorical prohibition of nuclear weapons, and I think that's a really good basis to start from. And this ban will codify legal rejection of nuclear weapons, and hopefully encourage other states to follow. Because we see from the past experiences that prohibition precedes elimination, not the other way around. We don't eliminate weapons and then prohibit them. It provides a necessary starting point. But it's not just a legal tool. It will also provide political space for states, international organizations, civil society, to carry out the political work that is necessary to make having nuclear weapons unacceptable. It will give focus to a movement that has been largely ignored since the end of the Cold War. And a ban will not force any state to disarm. Disarmament will happen when it's in the interest of states to disarm. And the key here for us, for the ban treaty, is to make it more in states' interest to disarm. As long as nuclear weapons remain central to security doctrines, seen as prestigeful, there will be very few incentives to disarm. And this treaty is meant to change that perspective and to make it more in the interest of states to want to move towards disarmament. So the negotiations will resume on 15th of June here in New York. There will be a lot of debate, a lot of heated discussion, I think, about the different provisions in the text. But I think that the first draft showed it's a good basis to start from. I think there is a significant chance that by 7th of July we will have a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons under international law. Thank you.